Sometimes life slows down. Dreams fade. Music stops. But love, even quiet love, can bring it all back. Hey everyone, welcome to Soul Destiny's Echo. Before we start, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. Your support helps us bring more heartfelt stories like this to life. And tell us, where are you watching from? We love reading your comments. Now, let's begin.
The house was too quiet now. It had been 3 years since Grandpa passed away. The garden had dried out, the piano keys gathered dust, and mornings felt long. Helen still woke up early out of habit. She made tea for one. The second cup, she still placed it on the table, just out of memory, but it stayed untouched. She used to hum while cooking, used to talk to the plants, used to play soft tunes on her piano after breakfast. Now she just sat by the window, watching leaves move in the wind. Sometimes she would whisper, "You'd laugh at me, wouldn't you, John?" and smile for a second, then look away, because the silence after that always hurt.
It was a Thursday morning, cloudy, a little cold, and the kettle whistled for no one but her. Helen sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steam curling above her cup. Her fingers wrapped around the mug, not for warmth, but for comfort. Then she heard the sound of the front gate, a familiar voice shouting, "Grandma, it's me!" Helen blinked, her lips curving just a little. Emily, her granddaughter, the only one who still visited without calling first. She opened the door, and there she was, hair pulled back in a messy bun, backpack half open, the kind of energy that made even silence move. Before Helen could say anything, Emily had her in a hug that smelled of rain and youth. "Grandma," she said, "you look beautiful." Helen laughed softly, shaking her head. "Beautiful? Oh, darling, I haven't combed my hair yet." Emily grinned. "Then it's naturally perfect." They sat together in the small living room that used to hold family laughter. The clock ticked. The walls carried old memories, birthdays, music, the faint smell of polish from the piano that hadn't been touched in years. Emily's eyes wandered and stopped there, the piano by the window. She tilted her head. "Do you still play, Grandma?" Helen's smile faded a bit. Her eyes fell to her lap. "Oh, no, dear," she said. "I stopped a long time ago." "Why?" Helen hesitated. Her hands fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve. She looked at the piano for a long time before saying quietly, "Because no one listens anymore." It came out soft but heavy, like a truth she'd been holding too long. Emily didn't speak first. She looked around the room, at the framed photos, the sunlight stretching across the old keys, and then back at her grandmother. She moved to the piano bench, ran her fingers along the edge, felt the dust, the stillness. Then she looked up and said, "Then I'll listen." Helen froze. Something in her chest shifted, something warm and unfamiliar. For a moment, she saw herself decades ago, her husband sitting in that same spot, nodding along as she played old love songs. The smell of Sunday breakfast, his laughter mixing with the melody. Her throat tightened. "It's been years, Emily," she whispered. Emily smiled, patting the empty space beside her. "Then we'll start small." So, slowly, like someone stepping into cold water, Helen walked over and sat down. The bench creaked under her, and the air felt different, alive again somehow. Her hands hovered over the keys, trembling. She whispered, "I've forgotten most of them." Emily said, "Then remember one note at a time." The first note came out rough, hesitant. Then another. It wasn't music yet, but it was something. Something alive, trembling, finding its way back. Emily leaned her head on Grandma's shoulder, listening. No words, just the soft sound of a heart remembering what joy felt like. When the short tune ended, the room was quiet again. But this time, it wasn't the heavy kind of quiet, it was warm, full. Helen looked down at her fingers and laughed a little, the sound breaking years of silence. She turned to Emily. "You shouldn't have made me cry." Emily smiled, wiping a tear from her cheek. "Then you shouldn't have stopped playing." They both laughed, and outside, the rain had stopped. That day, Helen played again. Not for an audience, not for applause. Just because someone, finally, was listening.
The next morning, sunlight touched the curtains for the first time in months. Helen stood by the window, her hands resting on the sill, watching the light spill across the little patch of garden outside. Weeds had taken over the roses, the soil had cracked, and the air smelled of dust instead of flowers. She sighed softly. That garden had once been her pride. Her husband used to tease her, saying she loved her plants more than him. She'd laugh and tell him, "Maybe, but you both need watering." Now the watering can sat rusted near the fence. The bench where they'd once shared tea was faded gray, its paint peeling like the years that had passed too quickly. Helen took a slow breath. Emily's visit had stirred something inside her. It wasn't just the piano. It was the way the house felt different when someone was there, the way her heart had lifted when the music returned. She picked up her old sun hat from the hook by the door. It still smelled faintly of lavender. Her husband used to buy her lavender soaps every spring. She smiled without meaning to. Out in the garden, the air was cooler than she expected. Birds fluttered nearby, curious. Helen bent down, her knees aching a little, and pulled out the first weed. It came free easily, and something about that simple act made her chest feel lighter. She worked slowly, carefully, one patch at a time, talking softly to the plants like she used to. "There you are, my darlings," she murmured, her voice trembling but kind. After an hour, she sat on the bench, breathing deeply. The garden wasn't beautiful yet, but it was no longer forgotten. It was alive again, just a little. As she sat there, she remembered the first time her husband had built that bench. It was their second year of marriage. They didn't have much money, but he'd stayed up all night sanding the wood, smiling the whole time. When she asked him why he didn't just buy one, he said, "Because this one will have your favorite corner built in." She had laughed for hours that day. Now her hand brushed that same corner, smooth from time. A tear rolled down her cheek before she could stop it. "Maybe you're still here," she whispered. The wind moved softly through the branches, as if answering her. That afternoon, Emily called. "Grandma, did you play today?" Helen smiled into the phone. "No, dear. Today I played in the dirt." Emily laughed. "That's even better." After the call ended, Helen sat back again and looked around. For the first time in years, she felt tired in a good way. The kind of tired that comes after doing something that matters. That night, before going to bed, she opened her diary, the one she hadn't touched since her husband passed. The pages were yellowed, but her handwriting still danced across them, filled with love, laughter, and little arguments that now felt sweet. She picked up her pen and wrote, "Today I cleaned the garden. It felt like sweeping the dust off my own heart." She paused for a moment, then added, "I think I'm ready to remember again." She closed the diary gently, and for the first time in many nights, slept peacefully. A week passed, and the garden began to look like itself again. The roses were shy, still learning to bloom,
But Helen had already started waking up with a reason. The silence in the house didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt peaceful, almost waiting for something. On Sunday, Emily visited again. She brought homemade cookies and a flyer. It was from the local community center. Across the top, in bright red letters, it said, "Silver Voices Choir. Join us." Helen laughed softly. "Oh dear, I haven't sung in years. Not since your grandfather used to play his silly guitar." Emily grinned. "Then maybe it's time to sing again." That night, Helen sat by the piano, thinking about it. Her fingers hovered over the keys, and she remembered all the evenings when the house used to be filled with songs. Her husband had the worst voice, but he sang anyway, off-key and full of life. She whispered to herself, "He never cared about being perfect. He just cared about being there." The next morning, she found herself standing outside the community hall. Her heart was racing a little. She almost turned back. Then she heard laughter inside. Soft, warm, familiar. When she walked in, a woman in her 60s smiled at her. "First time?" Helen nodded. "Don't worry," the woman said, handing her a cup of tea. "We're all a bit rusty." There were about 15 people there. Some old, some even older, a few using walking sticks, a few humming quietly to themselves. Someone started playing the piano, and slowly the room filled with shaky but honest voices. Helen felt her throat tighten. It wasn't perfect music, but it was real. It was life. When it was her turn, she hesitated. Then she closed her eyes and began to sing a song she and her husband used to love, a slow, tender tune about growing old together. Her voice cracked halfway, but no one minded. A few even joined in softly, their voices blending like memories. When the song ended, the room was silent for a second. Then came the sound of gentle applause. One of the older men smiled and said, "You've still got it." Helen laughed, a little shyly. It felt strange to laugh that freely again. After practice, they all stayed for tea and biscuits. Someone told jokes, someone talked about their grandchildren, and Helen just sat there, listening, smiling, feeling like she had found a piece of herself she didn't know was missing. That night, she came home tired, but her heart felt alive. Before going to bed, she wrote in her diary, "Today I sang again. My voice shook, but my soul didn't." Maybe music doesn't just bring back memories. Maybe it brings back the parts of us we thought were gone. She closed the book gently, placed it beside the photo of her husband, and whispered, "You'd laugh at how bad I sounded today." And if anyone had been listening, they might have heard the faint sound of her husband's laughter echoing through the quiet room.
It had been 2 weeks since Helen joined the choir. Every Tuesday and Friday, she took the same route through the park, passing the same trees, the same benches, but everything somehow looked brighter. Even the air felt lighter. She had started humming while cooking, singing softly when watering her plants. The piano keys no longer gathered dust. Every morning after her tea, she played one song, sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes for hours. One afternoon, while she played by the open window, her neighbor, Mrs. Carter, stopped by. She was holding a basket of fresh lemons. "Oh, Helen," she said, smiling, "I haven't heard music from this house in years. I almost thought you'd moved away." Helen laughed softly. "No, I just forgot to open the windows." Mrs. Carter stayed for tea, and before leaving, she said, "You know, the kids on our street could use a little music. They're always glued to their phones. You should show them what real melody feels like." That night, Helen couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about what Mrs. Carter said.
Music had given her life again, and maybe, just maybe, it could do the same for someone else. So the next morning, she placed a small handwritten sign on her front gate. It said, "Free piano lessons, all ages welcome." At first, no one came. She thought maybe people were too shy. But on the third day, a little boy appeared. His name was Oliver. His hands were small and shy like his smile. "Grandma said you teach music?" he mumbled. Helen nodded gently. "I don't teach much, dear. I just share what I know." He sat on the bench beside her. His fingers pressed the wrong keys. The notes were scattered and clumsy. But Helen smiled, because that's how every melody begins. Awkward, uncertain, but full of hope. By the end of the week, 2 more children came, then 3. Soon her living room was filled with laughter, with tiny fingers pressing keys, with songs that sounded messy, but alive. She looked at them and whispered under her breath, "This is what my house needed. Not silence, not perfection, just life." That evening, she sat at her desk and opened her diary again. The house used to echo with loneliness. Now it hums with music. Sometimes we don't need a miracle. Sometimes we just need to share what we love. She placed her pen down, looked at the piano, and smiled through the golden glow of sunset filling the room.
It was a quiet Sunday morning when Oliver came running to Helen's porch. His hands were covered in chalk, and his face carried that same spark children have when they are hiding a secret. "Grandma Helen," he said breathlessly, "we have something to tell you." Behind him stood 5 of her students, all holding small handmade posters. They were colorful and crooked, painted with big letters that read, "Sunday Music Recital at Miss Helen's house." Helen blinked in surprise. "Oh my," she laughed softly, "and who planned this?" All the children pointed at Emily, her granddaughter, who was standing behind them with a shy smile. "I thought it was time you shared your music again, Grandma," Emily said gently. "Everyone in the neighborhood wants to hear you play." Helen looked around. The front yard, once silent and still, was now filled with laughter. Children moving chairs, hanging little paper garlands, and neighbors stopping by to see what was happening. For the first time in years, the house felt alive. She hesitated, clutching her hands together. "What if I make mistakes?" she whispered. Emily placed a hand on her shoulder. "Grandpa used to say, a wrong note just means your heart was trying too hard." Helen felt tears rise behind her eyes. She smiled through them and nodded. "All right then, let's make some noise." By afternoon, the yard was full. Families sat on blankets, children held lemonade cups, and the piano was placed near the window, gleaming under the soft light. Helen wore her favorite blue dress, the one she hadn't touched since her husband's last birthday. She touched the piano keys and took a deep breath. The crowd quieted down. Her fingers trembled for a moment. Then, slowly, she began to play. It was the same song she used to play for her husband on Sunday mornings, the same melody that filled their home with laughter, the same tune he said made the world feel gentle. As she played, she could almost hear his voice again, see his smile in the corner of the room. Her heart swelled with something she hadn't felt in years: peace. When the song ended, the crowd stood up and clapped. The children cheered, neighbors smiled, and Emily ran to hug her tight. "Grandma, you were amazing!" Helen closed her eyes for a moment, the sound of applause washing over her like a warm wave. And when she opened them again, she whispered softly,
Maybe this was never about playing for others. Maybe it was about remembering who I am. That night, she sat by the window with her diary again. The page was still blank, but she already knew what she wanted to write. Today, I didn't just play music, I found myself again.
That evening, after everyone had gone home, the house fell quiet again. The garlands fluttered softly near the window, and the faint scent of lemonade still hung in the air. Helen sat by her piano, running her hand across the keys, feeling the faint warmth they still carried from the day's recital. She smiled to herself. For the first time in so long, she felt alive, not because of applause or people, but because the music had reminded her of something she'd almost forgotten: love. As she reached to close the piano lid, something caught her eye. A small, folded paper wedged between the bench cushion and the wood. She pulled it out gently, thinking it was one of Oliver's drawings. But when she unfolded it, her breath caught. It was his handwriting, her late husband's. The ink had faded a little, but the words were still clear. It was dated exactly 1 week before he passed. The paper trembled in her hands as she began to read. "My dearest Helen, if you ever find this letter, it means time has already taken me where I cannot return. But I don't want you to live in silence. Play the piano again, water the garden, laugh at silly things. You have so much more music left in you, and the world still needs to hear it. Don't stop just because I'm gone. Love doesn't end, Helen. It just changes rooms." Her eyes filled with tears, blurring the words. She held the paper close to her heart, whispering his name. "I thought you lost me," she said softly. "But you never really left, did you?" For a long moment, she just sat there, the lamp glowing beside her, the letter pressed against her chest. Outside, the wind moved through the garden, carrying the faint sound of chimes. And in that moment, she felt him, not as a memory, but as a presence. She whispered to the quiet room, "All right, my love, I'll keep playing." That night, she placed the letter inside her diary, right between the pages where she'd written about the recital. Then she smiled, a real, peaceful smile, and closed the book gently, as if sealing a promise.
The next morning, sunlight slipped quietly through the old lace curtains. Helen woke up earlier than usual, long before the birds began their morning chatter. She sat on the edge of her bed for a few minutes, rubbing her hands together the way she always did when she felt unsure about something. The letter was still beside her, resting on the nightstand. She looked at it, smiled faintly, and whispered, "All right, let's begin." Outside, the garden looked tired. Dry leaves covered the soil, and the little wooden fence her husband once built had started to lean. The roses were gone. Only a few stubborn daisies still stood, bending slightly in the cool air. She picked up the old watering can, brushed the dust from its handle, and carried it outside. The first splash of water on the earth made a soft, almost familiar sound. For a moment, she could almost hear his voice behind her. "Don't drown the poor things, Helen." She laughed, a real laugh, then shook her head. "Still bossing me around, aren't you?" As she moved from plant to plant, Emily walked up behind her, still in her pajamas. "Grandma, you're up early," she said, yawning. Helen turned, water droplets catching the light as they fell from her hand. "I figured the gardens waited long enough," she replied. Emily smiled. "Want some help?" Helen nodded.
Only if you don't mind getting dirt on those fancy slippers." They spent the whole morning cleaning up, trimming the bushes, pulling out weeds, planting new seeds Emily had brought from town. Now and then Helen would stop and tell her little stories about how her husband once tried to plant tomatoes but ended up growing nothing but stubborn green vines. About how they used to sit here in the evenings, sharing tea and complaining about how fast time went. Emily listened, sometimes laughing, sometimes just smiling quietly. At noon, they sat on the porch, both tired and covered in soil. Helen looked at her hands. They were shaky, yes, and older than she remembered, but they were alive again. "Feels good," she said softly. Emily nodded. "You make this place feel alive, Grandma." Helen looked at the little sprouts they'd planted and said, "Maybe it's the other way around." The following week, the neighbors started to notice the change. A few stopped by to say hello, to ask if they could help. Someone brought extra flower pots, another brought soil, and before long, the once quiet garden turned into a small community space. Laughter, chatter, and music drifting from Helen's piano through the open window. Every evening, she would sit by that window, watching the children play near the fence, and she'd whisper to herself, "You'd love this, dear. You really would." When she finally went to bed that night, the garden lights twinkled faintly outside, and the air smelled of fresh soil and jasmine. She closed her eyes and thought, maybe this is what healing looks like. Slow, quiet, but full of life.
A week later, Emily came home with a small flyer in her hand. It was crumpled and colorful, something made by local volunteers. "Grandma," she said, waving it in the air, "look what I found! The town community center is starting a choir again. They're looking for people who can actually sing." Helen laughed, shaking her head. "Oh, sweetheart, I haven't sung in years. The last time I tried, the cat ran away." Emily dropped the flyer on the table and crossed her arms. "I don't believe that," she said. "You used to sing me lullabies, remember? You sounded like sunshine." Helen smiled. "Sunshine doesn't have wrinkles or forgets the words halfway." But Emily just leaned on the table and said, "Come on, Grandma. Maybe it's time you let the world hear you again." That night, Helen sat alone by the piano. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the fridge and the ticking clock. Her fingers hovered above the keys like they had in her youth, but she hesitated. She wasn't sure if she still had it, the voice, the rhythm, the courage. But then she heard Emily in the next room humming an old song, the one she used to play for her husband every Sunday morning. Something inside her stirred. She started to play. Softly, unsure, but real. The melody trembled at first, but slowly it began to sound like home. A few days later, Emily dragged her to the community center. It was a small hall filled with people of all ages, some young, some gray-haired, all nervous in their own way. When Helen walked in, a few faces turned toward her. The choir director, a woman in her 40s with wild curly hair, smiled and said, "You must be Helen. I've heard about you." Helen laughed shyly. "Good things, I hope?" "All good things," the director said. "We could use a bit of heart around here." During the first rehearsal, Helen's voice was shaky. She missed a few notes, forgot a few lyrics, and laughed more than she sang. But by the second song, something magical happened. Her hands found rhythm again, her voice steadied, and for the first time in years, she felt weightless, like she'd stepped back in time. She could almost see her husband in the back row, clapping off beat like he always did. After practice, everyone stayed to chat. One of the younger singers said, "You've got the kind of voice that feels like a story, Mrs. Helen." Helen chuckled. "That's because it's got too many stories hiding inside it." They all laughed, but something in her eyes softened. That night, when she got home, she told Emily about every detail. The music sheets, the laughter, the warmth. Emily listened with a grin and said, "Told you, Grandma, you just needed a stage again." Helen hugged her granddaughter and whispered, "No, dear,
I just needed someone to listen again. The next week, the choir performed at the park. The air was cool, the audience small but kind. When Helen stepped forward for her solo, her heart raced. Then she took a deep breath and sang. The same song she'd once sung for her husband all those years ago. The one about time, love, and coming home. People clapped, some even cried. And as she bowed, Helen looked up at the sky and whispered, "This one's for you, my love."
The choir performance gave Helen something she hadn't felt in years: purpose. That night, after everyone left the park, she sat by her window with a cup of chamomile tea. The moonlight poured over the old wooden desk that had belonged to her husband. On top of it lay a dusty journal she hadn't opened since the year he passed. She touched the cover gently. Her handwriting from decades ago peeked through faded ink. Helen's Thoughts, 1983. She smiled a little. "Well, old friend, it's been a while," she whispered. When she opened it, the first page made her heart ache. There was a note written in her husband's hand. It said, "Keep writing, even when you think no one is reading. That's when your soul speaks loudest." Her eyes welled up, but she didn't cry. Instead, she picked up a pen and started writing again. At first, it was small things. Memories of him making coffee, the smell of rain on their porch, the sound of laughter echoing from the garden. Then it turned into something deeper. Reflections about growing old, about loneliness, about rediscovering joy when the world thinks you're done. Emily found her writing one evening and read a few lines quietly. "Grandma," she said softly, "this is beautiful. You should share it." Helen shook her head. "Oh no, dear, this is just for me." But Emily smiled and said, "Maybe someone out there needs to hear it too." A week later, Emily secretly typed one of Helen's journal entries and posted it on a local community website under the title, "Letters from Grandma Helen." By morning, dozens of comments appeared. Strangers thanked her for her words, saying they reminded them of their own grandparents, of love, of hope. When Helen saw it, she was shocked. "You posted my writing?" Emily winced. "Don't be mad. People loved it." Helen stared at the screen, hand over her heart. "People really read this?" Emily nodded, grinning. "Grandma, they didn't just read it, they felt it." From that day, Helen wrote every evening. Letters to her late husband, letters to herself, letters to anyone who might need to remember that life doesn't stop at 70. Soon, Letters from Grandma Helen became a small online column. People began mailing her real letters. Some shared their own stories. Others just thanked her for making them feel less alone. One afternoon, she received a handwritten note that said, "Your words made me call my mother after 5 years. Thank you." She pressed the paper to her chest and smiled through tears. It felt like a circle. Kindness given, kindness returned. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she wrote her favorite line yet. "I thought my story ended when I lost him. But love keeps finding new chapters." The house was quiet that evening. The faint tick of the old wall clock, the hum of the night breeze, the soft scent of jasmine from the garden. Helen sat by her piano again. The same one that had been silent for years, but tonight it felt different. There was no audience, no choir, no performance, just her. She looked at the framed photo of her husband on the shelf. He was smiling, young, eyes full of mischief. "Do you remember this song?" she whispered. Her fingers rested on the keys. The first few notes came out shaky. Then, slowly, her hands found their rhythm. It was the song they had danced to on their wedding night, a melody that once filled small rooms and big hearts. She closed her eyes, letting every note carry her memories.
The laughter, the dinners, the quiet mornings with 2 cups of tea. Every sound felt like a heartbeat she thought she had lost. When she finished, she didn't cry. She smiled, because she realized something. Grief had never truly taken away her music. It had only paused it, waiting for her to find the courage to play again. Emily came downstairs holding her phone, recording quietly. "Grandma?" she said softly. "That was beautiful." "Oh, don't record this old lady." Emily grinned. "Too late? The internet's going to love this." That night, Emily posted the video online. My grandma found her song again. By morning, it went viral. Thousands of people commented, saying it made them call their grandparents, hug their parents, or sit by their old piano again. When Helen saw the video, she laughed. Then she whispered to herself, "Well, old man, I guess we're both still making people smile." That evening, she wrote her final diary entry. "The house isn't empty anymore. It sings. It breathes. And so do I." She placed the pen down, closed the journal, and looked out the window. The sunset painted the sky in gold and rose, and she smiled softly. Tomorrow, she would plant new flowers, because tomorrow was still hers to live. Moral: you're never too old to begin again. Life doesn't end with loss. It begins again with love.